And I notice a lot of things. And y'all know me, I'm different. I notice things that other people might not, like, when Sherry tried to jump up from the piano and make her escape in the choir, he said, no, just stand right there and let everybody look at it for me. It was killing her, I could tell. She was going, y'all get me out of here. I happened to notice stuff like that. And I was sitting here thinking that, Taylor, wonderful job, great song. I love that song. But I got to think about the first time I ever preached at Union Baptist Church. Taylor was maybe 5. Maybe. I'm getting old. And I was reminded of that again. Diane and I celebrated our anniversary this week, 44 years. And we took off to the mountains for a day or two there at the point. Now, there's a reason I'm telling you a story. We get up there we left Thursday morning, and there's a couple of things that stood out about this whole trip to me. Is we started out, and we hadn't gone very far up the road, and Diane looked at me and she said, okay, here's the rules for this trip. There's always rules. She said, you can't talk about the church. Do you know how hard that is? I'm the preacher. We'd be right on, we'd just be talking about this, that, or other and everything, and I'd start to say something, she said, up. Y'all know what that means, guys. That means hush.
Yes.
Because I start to say something about, I got to think about church. Up. Can't go back to it. It was an adventure. But we get up there, and we got there a little bit early. We couldn't check in yet, and so Diane saw us from the antique store. She said, let's go in there for a minute. That's okay. So I pull in the parking lot, and I should have known it would happen. But I pull in this parking lot, and we get out of the truck, and we're walking across the parking lot to this little store. And there was a gentleman came out of the store, and he walked past us, and I said hello, and he said hello. And so we just kept walking, and we get almost to the door, and all of a sudden this gentleman that just went past and said, sir. And there was nobody else out there, so I figured he had to be talking to me, and I turned around and I said, yes. And I took a few steps toward him, and he said, is that your truck? And I went, yes. And I was thinking, did I hit something? I mean, there was no cars parked around me. I didn't park near him or anything. And he said, is that your truck? And I said, yes, it is. He said, are you from Wilcox County? And I said, here we go. Don't matter where you go. And I started to say, no, I stole the truck, but I didn't. I said, yeah, yes, sir, I am. And he said, do you live in Rochelle? I said, no, sir, I don't live in Rochelle. He said, where do you live? I said, Pitts. He said, I know where Pitts is. I said, how do you know where Pitts is? He said, every summer when I was growing up, I spent 2 weeks with my grandmother who lived in Rochelle. I said, you're kidding. He said, nope. I said, well, what was the family name? He said, Fountain. I said, what is your name? And folks, I'm getting old and losing my mind. I can't remember his first name, but his last name was Fountain. I said, you're kin to Denny Fountain and Mickey Newell and Darrell Hardy. And he said, oh, I don't know. I said, trust me. You're kin to all them people. He said, how do you know them? I said, they live in Pitts. They ain't enough people. Everybody knows everybody in Pitts. And he said, well, you know where Union Baptist Church is? I said, here we go. Don't matter where I go. Look, we were in Macon one time. I was looking at a suit at this store, and this lady comes up and she says, you need a suit? And I said, no, I'm just getting tired. Of course I need a suit. That's why I'm in here looking, And she said, well, where are you from? I said, Pitt. She said, you know where Union Baptist Church is? And I went, really? I can't go anywhere without somebody saying, hey, you know where Union Baptist Church is? Anyway, this guy said, you know where Union Baptist Church is? I said, yeah, I know right where it's at. He said, you know anybody that goes there? I said, 1 or 2. He said, who do you know that goes there? I said, just pick one. He said, how you know him? I said, I'm the pastor there. He said, you're kidding. I said, nope, not kidding at all. I mean, it was like, here we go. It don't matter where you go. So the reason for this whole story, and we had a nice conversation. I told him, I said, well, come on back down, go to church with us. I'll ride you around. You can tell me some things, and I can tell you some things, and what I really want to say is you can give me some dirt on some of them people that I know down there. But I didn't do that. And here's the whole point of that story. Look, if you go off somewhere, either cover up your tag or behave. Because somebody gonna know you. Or know somebody that knows you. Okay? It's amazing. It doesn't matter where I go. People ask me, hey, you know where Union is? Folks, let me tell you something. This church has a very good reputation. It don't matter where you go. I tell you what, let's try to keep it that way. You know what I'm saying? John chapter 18. Some people will say this is more of an Easter sermon, but really it's not. Okay, we can talk about it anytime. And I don't want to keep you too long. Anyway, I'll tell you something else about this trip. We on the way up to the mountains, we get up there past Commerce, we in them hills, and it's just really good. And Diane says, I want you to look at that. And I said, what? She said, look at that truck. We was fixing to pass this truck. And on the back of the trailer, it had a Harold Martin truck in Rochelle. What are the chances? And I got up a little bit further. I said, that's Eddie Peach driving that truck. And so I said, wave at him when we go by. And so we went by, and I honked the horn, and Diane was looking at him just waving, and he honked the horn. And I called him. I picked up the phone, I called him. He said, hey, what's going on? I said, dude, I just passed you. He said, that was you. I said, yeah, that was me. Don't matter where you go, you're going to see somebody. You better behave.
Okay.
These verses of Scripture that we talk about right here, it talks about the trial of Jesus before Pilate. Now listen, the Jews had already tried Jesus, remember? They had already taken him before the high priest, Caiaphas, and they found him guilty of blasphemy. In other words, they said, you claim to be God, and they wanted him put to death. But there was a problem, you see. The Jews were under Roman rule, and the Jews couldn't put anybody to death, but they wanted him dead. The religious leaders, the high priest, they wanted Christ dead. He was ruining their whole get-up. He was ruining the setup they had. He was ruining their power and control. He was hurting their cause with the truth. And they wanted him gone. And so they tried him before Caiaphas, the high priest, and they found him guilty of blasphemy. And under Jewish law, that meant a death penalty. The problem was the Jews, under Roman rule, couldn't put anybody to death. They didn't have the authority. For somebody to be put to death, they had to be put to death by the Romans, and the Romans wouldn't put anybody to death for violating the Jewish law because it didn't mean anything to them. And so the Jews had to take Jesus to Pilate and say, look, we've tried it, and we want you to try it. And so they took him to Pilate. You know, it's interesting, Pilate. We look at Pilate from the Gospels, and, you know, I did a little research, and from looking at the secular sources of the day, reading Josephus and some of the other historians of the day, we find out that Pilate really wasn't the guy that most people would get along with. He, from what we can tell from the secular people, he was pretty insensitive. He was impetuous, and they said he was very rude, which I can believe from a Roman governor at that time. But if you look at the Gospels, what do we know about Pilate from the Gospels? Well, we don't know a whole lot other than the fact that he conducted the trial of Jesus. And I can tell you, when I was studying this and when I was putting this together, I thought about showing a lot, his honor, because it has to do with criminal procedure and the proper procedure in court. Y'all have all heard it, you know, he was released on a technicality. What does that mean? That means that improper procedure was used. That's why we have the judge, to make sure the proper procedures are followed in court. And in criminal investigation, you have to follow the proper procedures, or your whole case can get thrown out. And so there's this whole thing in the law books in Georgia, the code section, about criminal procedure and what you have to do in following it to make sure things are done properly. Well, Pilate was the judge. Pilate was the one who had to ensure that things were done properly in a Roman court of law, and that's what this really was. So they take him to Pilate. Now, Pilate, we can learn all kinds of things from secular sources, but from the Gospels we look at it, and Pilate conducted the trial. And guess what? He did it correctly. He followed procedure exactly. He followed it precisely. You know what? He came to the right verdict. He chose the right verdict. He said Christ is innocent. He came to the correct verdict. But the problem with Pilate was, even though he came to the correct verdict, he crucified him anyway. See, Pilate was faultless up to that point. He had done everything correct, right up to the point where he said, yeah, he's innocent, but I'm going to put him to death anyway. Folks, see, that's where we get into things. And you know what? It occurred to me when I was studying this that humans will go to great lengths, won't they? I mean, and we see it today. You know, humans, they go through all these external forms in any given situation, but they deny the reality of what the forms stand for. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples, okay, from this story right here. And we're going to start reading in just a minute. But if you go up in verse 28 of chapter 18, it says, Then led they Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment. Now that was a Roman hall. That was where the Roman trials were held, the Roman hall of judgment, okay? It says they led him there, and it was early, and they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they be defiled, that they might eat Passover. You see, this is during time Passover. You know this story. They had to get this trial done quickly, get Jesus on the cross quickly, because Passover was coming that afternoon. And these good Jewish men, these good religious leaders wanted to be able to celebrate the Passover, so they had to get done with this trial and get Jesus killed before the Passover started. And if they did something that made them ceremonially unclean, they would not be able to participate in the Passover feast. And if they had gone into that Roman building, it would have made them ceremonially unclean. That's why the Bible tells us right there that they didn't go into the hall of judgment, because it would have made them unclean. Now stop and think about this. They intended to murder an innocent man, and they were worried about being ceremonially unclean. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about human beings will go to great lengths to follow these external forms of a situation, but they don't realize what the reality of those forms are. Folks, let me tell you something. These were the religious leaders, and they intended. You know what I found out when I went to law enforcement? That to prove any crime, you have to prove intent. You got to prove that there was intent to commit the crime. Folks, they intended to kill Jesus. They were going to commit murder, which was wrong in the eyes of man and wrong in the eyes of God. But they was worried about being ceremonially unclean. You know, people do that nowadays. Well, I can't do this because, boy, what if somebody in church found out? I can't do it. Folks, let me tell you something. We get up on Sunday morning and we go to great lengths to fix our hair and clean up. And boy, y'all better be glad I tried. Because if you saw me when I first got up, oh my Lord. Those of you that really don't like this, y'all see it first thing in the morning. We go to great lengths to fix up and dress up and clean up. How many times do we think about what our soul is like before we walk in? How many times do we stop and think, maybe I should stop and pray and ask God to take a look at me before I go into His presence? Folks, listen, that's what they were doing. They were too worried about being unclean ceremonially. I'm going to get to the sermon in a minute. I ain't started yet. They intended to kill somebody, but they were worried about what? But you know what? There's another example of that in Pilate himself. Look, he made a great show of putting on a good trial, didn't he? He made a show of justice. He wanted it to be clear that the Romans were serious when it came to justice. They were going to do it, and they were going to do it right. And he did that. But in the end, he allowed a mob to influence him to kill an innocent man. Folks, are we guilty of that nowadays? I hope not. Let's take our Bibles, look at chapter 18 of John. Stand with me. We're going to read it. And we're going to start in verse 33. It says, Then Pilate entered into the judgment hall again and called Jesus and said unto him, Art thou the King of the Jews? And Jesus answered him, Sayest thou this thing of thyself, or did others tell it thee of me? And Pilate answered him, I, a Jew, your own nation and the chief priest have delivered thee unto me. What hast thou done? And Jesus answered, My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered unto the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence. And Pilate therefore said unto him, Art thou the king then? And Jesus said, You say that I am a king. To this end was I born, and for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Every one that is of the truth heareth my voice. And Pilate said unto him, What is truth? Boy, that's philosophers have been debating that one for years, haven't they? What is truth? And when he had said this, he went out again unto the Jews and said unto him, I find no fault at all. He got it right. He got it right, but he did the wrong thing. Father, I pray that you would help us to understand this morning. Or may we understand as we look at the trial who was really on trial. Who was it that was really being judged in this instant? Heavenly Father, help us to realize that it applies to us as well. For us in your name we pray. You see, there were certain forms that the trial had to take, and I bet you if you talk to his honor over here, he'd tell you the same thing. When it comes to a trial, you have to follow the right procedure. You have to do things right. You see, in the Roman court, there were 4 elements to a trial. Number 1, there was the indictment. You had to have some kind of charge brought against somebody. Then you had the examination by the prosecution. Then you have to give the defense a chance to refute the prosecution's argument, and then you have a verdict. And pretty much that's the way our courts run today, with a few little minor things here and there. People over there, not ain't minor, you got it, but to me they're okay. But basically that's the way our courts operate nowadays. First of all, you got to have an indictment brought against somebody. You've heard it on the news today, so-and-so was indicted for this many charges, right? That's what that means. Charges were brought against them, okay? Now, every one of these elements was present in the trial that Christ had before Pilate, okay? And the proceedings began with Pilate as the judge, okay? And he looks at the Jews who were standing outside because they wouldn't go into the hall, and he said, What are you charging this man with? What is the charge? What is the indictment? And you know what? Something that I found. They didn't read an indictment. You know what they said? Look up here. Pilate went out to them in this verse 29 and said, What accusation bring you against this man? And they answered and said unto him, If he were not a malefactor or a criminal, we wouldn't have delivered him up to you. You know what they were saying? He's a criminal. Trust me. That's what they were saying. Just trust me. He's a criminal. You know, I've told you this before. I like this thing. I still hold to it, okay? In God we trust. Everybody else gets searched. He wasn't about to take their word for it. He said, look, if we're going to have a trial, a proper Roman trial, then we're going to do it the way it ought to be done. We're going to follow the procedure. We're going to do it correctly. You will have an indictment against this man. But they weren't bringing an indictment. They just said, look, he's a criminal, put him to death. And they wanted Pilate to just rubber stamp it and get it done. And Pilate wouldn't do that. He said no. And Pilate basically looked at him and said, you don't need me. If you can't tell me what the man was charged for. Now remember, the Romans didn't care about Jewish law. They could have said, well, we found him guilty of blasphemy. That's a Jewish charge. You deal with it. But they couldn't do that because they couldn't put him to death, and they wanted him put to death. And so what did they do? They lied. They just made up charges. You know, when they wouldn't give him a charge, Pilate said unto them, take ye him and judge him according to your law. And then they came back and they charged him with 3 things. They made up 3 charges, okay? They had charged him with blasphemy. And under Jewish law, he could be put to death for that, but the Romans wouldn't allow it. And so they had to do something to get Pilate to try. And so they made up charges. Okay? Number one, they said he's subversive. He is subverting the nation. Now, was that a Roman law? Yes. Was it serious? Yes. Was it guilty of, or was it worthy of the death penalty? Yes, it rose to that level. But you know what? They weren't able to prove that in front of Pilate. And if they weren't able to prove it, he said that one's thrown out. So that one didn't work. And then they said, well, you know, he is accused of telling everybody not to pay taxes. Was that a crime in Rome? Yes. Did it rise to the level of the death penalty? Yes. Could they prove it? No. Some things never change. Is it a crime not to pay your taxes in America? Will they put you to death? They'll make you think they are. But what did Jesus say when he was in the trial before Caiaphas? You know, Caiaphas said, are you a king? Do you think we ought to bow to the Romans and everything? And so what did Christ do? He said, give me a coin. And he said, whose inscription is that? And Caiaphas said, well, it's Caesar's. He said, render therefore unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, but unto God that which is God's. What was he saying? He was saying, if Caesar says pay taxes, pay taxes. Hey, I don't like it either, but take it up with God. I didn't say it. So they couldn't prove that. In fact, Jesus could very easily disprove the fact that he was not trying to subvert the nation. He wasn't trying to get out of paying the taxes. And he told everybody else, pay your taxes. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's. But give to God what is God's. But then they said this. He says he's a king. Now Pilate kind of perked up on that. Why? Well, wait a minute. If you're a king, then you're an enemy of Rome. Could he have been put to death for that? Oh, yeah. Yeah, he could. And that was the only thing that they were able to say to Pilate to make Pilate think twice about it, okay? And so we get to this indictment, and they had indicted him as being a king. And so then we get to the examination part of it, where Pilate, who is, now this was a trial before the judge. There was no jury. Pilate was acting as the judge and the jury in this. He was going to hear the facts of the case, and he was going to make a verdict. He was going to come to a conclusion and follow, and come to a verdict. And he came to the right one, by the way. But anyway, he starts his examination. He goes back into Jesus, and he says, are you the king of the Jews? Because if Christ said, yes, I am king, that would make him an enemy of Caesar's. And you know what? From a Roman perspective, Jesus wasn't a king. From the Jewish perspective, he was. He was the king. He was the Messiah. And folks, whether you want to admit it or not, he still is the king. He was then and he is now. He's the King of Kings. He is the one who really matters. He's the one who everybody will stand before one day. And Romans didn't care about what the Jewish perspective was. He wanted to know if Christ was a king. Was he breaking a Roman law? And then he gave Christ a chance to present the defense. And Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. Now, you know what? When he said, my kingdom, that perked Pilate up, didn't it? Wait a minute. Who has a kingdom? A king has a kingdom. And he said, so you are a king. You are a king. What did Christ say? He said, well, you're saying I'm a king. Jesus said, you're right, I am a king. And for this reason was I born. Now, you know what? I got to think about that. And I came up with a little sideline here, a little sideline. Now, I want to ask you a question. See, I'm weird. I think about things like this. Why were you born? You ever stop and think about that? Why were you born? Why was I born? I have asked that question of myself and of God many times. Lord, why in the world was I born? You know, we go through life, and life's not always easy. Life's hard, and we wonder, why in the world was I born into this kind of situation? Lord, why am I going through this? Lord, what is it that I've done? It might not be anything that you've done, but you go back to the question, why was I born? People say, well, I guess I was born just to be a good husband or a good wife. Hey, that's a good thing to be. Be a good husband. Be a good wife. I think God expects that. You know, or maybe I was born to be a good parent. You need to be a good parent. You know what? Or I was born to be a good grandparent. That's the one I'm doing now. Maybe I was born to be a good grandparent. You know what? I've heard people say this. I was born to be a cop. I can identify with that. I love being a cop. Folks, if it hadn't been for the grace of God, I'd still be a cop. I love it. I miss it sometimes. I don't miss it near as much as I used to. But I wasn't born to be a cop. That's just what I did for the Lord. You know, I've heard people say, I was born to be a preacher. You may or may not agree, but some people would say, I was born to be a preacher. I think that God called me to preach, and so that's why I'm doing it, okay? But is that really why I was born? Why were you born? You know what? Jesus said, for this reason I was born. And for this reason I came into this world, that I should do what? Bear witness unto the truth. You want to know why you were born? You were born to glorify God and bear witness unto the truth. That's why you were born. The question is, are you doing that? Folks, that's what we are to do as Christians, as human beings. God wants us to come to Him in a saving faith and bear witness unto Him and unto the truth. And there's only one place to find truth, and that's God's Word. That's ultimate truth. That's the only truth. I don't want to get off on this, well, that's your truth, but not my truth. Let me tell you something. No, it ain't my truth. That's God's truth. And that makes it final. Folks, listen, you were born to bear witness to the truth. And He said, Pilate, look, my kingdom is of the truth. You see, Caesar's empire was an empire over matter. It was over things. Caesar's empire was over people and land and armies and possessions. Christ's kingdom is a kingdom of people's soul. And it is a kingdom of truth. Look at verse 37. Pilate therefore said unto him, Art thou king then? And Jesus answered, You say that I am a king. To this end was I born, and for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. And every one that is of the truth heareth my voice. Do you hear His voice? Are you of the truth? And then Pilate just turned away, and he said, What is true? But then we have the verdict. It's a good verdict. Pilate said, I find no fault in him. He's not guilty of anything. Now Pilate, he came to the right verdict. Okay? And Pilate was guilty of nothing up to this point except doing a good job. He conducted a trial, and he did it following the correct procedure. He outlined it. He did everything he was supposed to do, and he weighed the evidence, and he came to the correct verdict. But he failed to do the right thing. He didn't release Jesus, and he should. He should have been released right there. You know what, I've heard people, especially preachers, talk about this and say, you know, when Jesus was on trial before Pilate, who was it that was really on trial? Think about this. Was it Jesus that was on trial? People say on the surface, you look at it, yeah, it is. But folks, I'm here to tell you, I think that Pilate was the one on trial before Jesus. And Pilate looked pretty good right up until he did the very last thing he did, and then he was guilty. He didn't do the right thing. And you know what? We can be very critical of Pilate. But folks, we all fall short. We all fall short. You know, y'all know this about me by now. I've seen a lot of preachers and a lot of church members, for that matter, walk around their whole life trying to make everybody in the world think that they are holier than thou, and they're the most righteous person in the world. And I don't know if there's anything wrong with that or not, but let me tell you something. They're sinners just like everybody else. And folks, there's one thing that I have never wanted to do in my life, and that's this: hold myself up to be something I'm not. Folks, I'm just a sinner like everybody else. I am not perfect. I make mistakes. Y'all know that. We all fall short just like Pilate. We're all condemned before a holy God because of our sin. But you know what? There comes a point in our life when we have to make a decision just like Pilate. Is Jesus right? Or is he wrong? You know what? Pilate made the right decision. He said he's right. But then he had him killed, or allowed him to be killed. And folks, there are people now, I've talked to a lot of people, hey man, let me talk to you about Jesus. We start talking about, you know what? I agree with you. Jesus was a perfect guy. Jesus was a great guy. Jesus was this, Jesus was that. But they don't want to accept him. It's the same thing, Pilate. It's the same thing. Folks, we're in the same position. Just doing what Pilate did. There will come a point in everybody's life when they have to make a decision of what to do with Jesus. See, Pilate was making that decision right then. He was making that decision. What am I going to do with this guy? He's innocent, but what am I going to do with him? He's right, but what am I going to do with him? So here's the question. What will you do with Jesus? That's the decision that you have to make. We all have to make. What will you do? Father, I pray that you would take this time. And Father, I pray that people would make the right decision. I pray that they would make the decision for you. Father, I pray that they might make the decision for you, so that one day when they stand before you, the decision has been made and there will be no fault found. Because those faults, although they're many, will be covered by the blood. Father, I ask that you would deal with the hearts of people today. For it's in your name we pray.